Assalamu alaikum class. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the ascending and the descending tracts of the spinal cord and fact CNS. And before I start the descending tracks and start showing you the pictures, I'm going to teach you the ascending tracks, majorly which are the most important, uh, by drawing it. So just listen to this very carefully. So whenever we talk about the ascending tracks, they are always sensory because they're going to get into the CNS, right? So they always bring the input. So ascending to, as in my last lecture, I told you that in the main sensory relay is thalamus. So the most important track that you need to study in your neuroscience module is basically the spinothalamic track. So you know every ascending track starts with the prefix spino because they're always entering into the spinal cord and then eventually they go to their destinations. So they can be spinocerebellar, they can be spinoreticular, they can be spinothalamic. So out of these all ascending tracks, the most important track that you need to understand in details is the spinothalamic track. So it starts with spinal cord and it ends somewhere in the thalamus and eventually goes further into the cortical areas. So that's called spinothalamic tract. So when we talk about the spinothalamic tract, they're further divided into two major systems. So this is something that फिजियोलॉजी वाले लोग ज़्यादा कवर करते हैं बट मैं आपको इसका मेजर कॉन्सेप्ट दे रहा हूँ ताकि आप लोग के लिए आसानी हो जाए. So when you talk about the spinothalamic tract is further divided into two major systems. One is known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. So we'll go to the details of it in a while. And then the other system is basically the anterior lateral system. So before I go into the details of it, so before that, let's just revise a little bit the structure of the spinal cord. So we all know that the spinal cord looks like this, not exactly like this. It's a very bad diagram, but still, समझने के लिए कोई टेंशन नहीं. So we know we have a gray matter. This is the gray matter, which is an H-shaped structure. Any input which is coming, for example, from a receptor, you give a stimulus to a receptor, it goes through a sensory neuron, which is the dorsal root ganglion. It enters into the dorsal gray horn always. So if you revise, this is the dorsal column. So if the track or the sensory neuron enters into the dorsal column, it enters into the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. Or alternatively, if it decussates here and then divides into and enters into the lateral column and the white column, and then eventually it ascends upwards, this would be known as the anterolateral system. So the name is basically on the basis of the white matter the neuron is entering into. So if it's entering into the dorsal column, that means you're talking about the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. And if it is entering into the lateral column as well as the anterior column all together, this is known as the anterolateral system because there's no demarcation between anterolateral system. Sorry, anterolateral column, right? So this is just a revision. Now let's just talk about specifically about these systems. First, I'll talk about the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. So imagine this is the right side of the body. This is the left side of the body. This is for your own reference. I'm going to make a spinal cord here. Every time I make it, it gets bad. Okay, let's. So this is a spinal cord. Let's just say. All right, it's a cut section of spinal cord. So from the left side of the body, एक receptor है. उस receptor ने एक stimulus receive किया. That receptor is receiving that stimulus and finally sending a signal to the sensory neuron to the, this is the dorsal root ganglion. It's a single neuron. It goes and enters into the dorsal gray horn. And from there, it basically divides into medial and lateral branch. The medial branch enters into the dorsal column. Now it ascends upward. Now remember, there's no synapses. This is still one neuron, still single neuron, no synapses at all. Enters into the dorsal column. Now finally it is ascending upwards. So we're pretty much covered with the dorsal column side of it. Okay. So it's running into the dorsal column, going up all the way. and where it finally reaches the medulla oblongata. So if you remember the medulla oblongata, it has two paired nuclei on the posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. This is medulla oblongata. So this would be the nucleus gracilis. This would be the nucleus cuneatus. So if the sensation is coming from the lower limb, it will go into the nucleus gracilis. If it's coming from the upper limb, it will go into the nucleus cuneatus. You guys have already covered that in brainstem. So, but before going all the way, it decussates first, and then finally synapses to either gracilis or cuneatus. So from left side to right side, this is the sensory decussation. Now, this is where my first order neuron has ended. This was my first order neuron because अब जाके synapse आई है. अब तक ये बिल्कुल single handedly चल रहा था. Then what happens? Now the tract that runs from the nucleus gracilis or cuneatus, this is the ascending tract. Now this tract is finally now known as the medial lemniscus. So we have covered this much part of it. Now these tract finally they ascend and they finally reach the thalamus of that side. They synapse there. So this would be my medial lemniscus would be my second order neuron. Okay. Then finally you have the cerebral cortex of that side, and from here the thalamus through internal capsule, these fiber, the third order neuron, finally go to the cortical areas. Now these are known as the corona radiata. Why we call them corona radiata? Because they're originating from single source, but they're expanding like rays into the cortical areas of the brain. So that's basically the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. So this is one spinothalamic tract, one of the types of the spinothalamic tracts, and this is called dorsal column medial lemniscus system. Now, quick review. There are two things that you need to know. The first order neuron is much longer. Okay. The second order neuron is shorter. Okay, and the decussation is occurring at the level of medulla oblongata. So from the anatomical point of view, these are the two differences that you need to understand. The first order neuron is longer in dorsal column medial lemniscus system, while the decussation is occurring at the level of medulla oblongata. So I'll give you like 2 minutes to just take a snap of it so that you can revise it later, because I'm going to remove the ink now. All right. Now I'm going to talk about the anterolateral system. If you talk about the anterolateral system, so this name suggests that it's going to involve the anterior and the lateral column of the spinal cord. So I'm going to make the spinal cord again. It's the most difficult thing to do. So this is the right side of the body again. This is the left side of the body again. Left side का एक receptor है, उस पे stimulus आया, sensory neuron आ रहा है. That's your first order neuron which is coming. It enters into the dorsal gray horn, and here it synapses with another neuron present already in the dorsal gray horn. So my first order neuron has to end here. So here it synapses with this neuron. Now the fiber of this neuron, the second order neuron, finally decussates at the level of the spinal cord only. So it comes from the left side to the right side here. Now it divides into the lateral branch and an anterior branch. Both of the branch combine together and they ascend upwards. Now they're going all up and they're running in the anterior and the lateral column. So since they have already decussated, so they don't synapse at the medulla oblongata, they ignore the medulla oblongata and then finally reach the thalamus, where they finally synapse again. And from here, the fibers that originate and they go to the cerebral cortex, these are still the third order neuron known as the corona radiata. So that's anterolateral system. So comparatively, you know that in anterolateral system, the second order neuron is much longer compared to the first order neuron in dorsal column medial lemniscus system. And the second difference was anatomical difference would be that the decussation in anterolateral system is occurring at the level of spinal cord, while the decussation is occurring at the level of medulla oblongata in dorsal column medial lemniscus system. Now, as we talk about the physiology of it, so now I am going to tell you कि हमें क्यों जरूरत है इन दो ट्रैक्स की एंड व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस एट फिजियोलॉजिकल लेवल. कौन सी चीजें हैं जो कि आपकी डोर्सल कॉलम मीडियल हेमिस्फीयर सिस्टम से जा रही हैं और कौन सी चीजें हैं जो एंटीरियर लैटरल सिस्टम से जा रही हैं. So obviously they're going to be the sensations. तो आपके पास दो तरीके हैं. Either you can memorize them, जो कि आप सारी जिंदगी करते आए हैं. Otherwise you can make a concept. I'm going to give you both of them. So आप just suit yourself आपको करना क्या है. For me the concept is anything. Think about any sensation which is localized, जिसको आप आसानी से एक specific point पर बता सकते हैं कि यहाँ sensation आ रही है. For example, fine touch. For example, vibration senses. For example, 2 point discrimination, or let's say this is pretty much about it, like very fine touch, vibration, 2 point discrimination, maybe proprioception. This is also very much localized. Okay, so this is one thing. So anything that you can localize easily, anything that goes which is generalized. For example, आपको अगर कोई पेन स्टिमुलस होता है तो उसमें यू ऑलवेज टेल कि मुझे इस एरिया में पेन हो रहा है. यू कैन नेवर टेल कि मुझे सिर्फ एक छोटा सा एक पॉइंट है पेन जितना जो मुझे दर्द हो रहा है. सो बेसिकली पेन, टेम्परेचर, आपको जलता भी हमेशा एक एरिया पे है. कभी भी नहीं बता सकते कि स्पेसिफिक इस पार्ट पे जलन हो रही है. इट ऑलवेज इन्वॉल्व इन एरिया. इट्स जनरलाइज्ड. देन सिमिलरली क्रूड टच एंड द सेक्सुअल सेंसेशंस. ठीक है, सो दैट्स आल्सो पार्ट ऑफ द anterolateral system. Now, the major another difference physiological that dorsal column. अगर for example example देते हैं, if I give you an example of a slap, अगर एक शख्स ने एक दूसरे शख्स को मुंह पे रख के चमाट मारा, so what do you think would be the first thing the person जिसने चमाट रिसीव किया है वो फील करेगा? He will always फील द टच फर्स्ट एंड उसके बिल्कुल थोड़े टाइम बाद उसको पेन होना स्टार्ट होगा और थोड़े टाइम बाद उसका जो गाल है जहाँ उसको चमाट पड़ा है वो थोड़ा सा गर्म होना शुरू हो जाएगा. सो प्लीज रिमेंबर वन थिंग दैट द डोर्सल कॉलम सिस्टम इज अ फास्ट ट्रैक. सो ये फॉरन रियल टाइम में ये ना ये फील हो जाता है, जबकि ALS से जितने भी सेंसेशन आए दीज आर द स्लो ट्रैक्स. सो इनकी हमेशा परसेप्शन थोड़ी सी स्लो होती है. ठीक है, क्योंकि यहाँ पे टाइप सी फाइबर्स यूज हो रहे हैं और यहाँ पे टाइप ए फाइबर्स यूज हो रहे हैं. So these are the physiological differences of the ascending tracts. So this covers the ascending tracts. Now let's talk about the descending tracts. Now if you talk about the descending tracts will always be the motor tracks जो कि नीचे उतर रहे होते हैं. Now when we talk about the descending tracts, before going there we need to know first about the upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. ये क्या होते हैं, क्या चीज़ होती है, इनका डिफरेंस समझ लेते हैं पहले. So upper motor neurons are basically the neurons which are present entirely in the CNS. So either they originate from anywhere from the upper higher centers of the brain, and finally they end at any level of the spinal cord. So they can originate from the cerebral cortex, they can originate from cerebellum, they can also originate from the brainstem. And they are responsible to form the descending tracts, which we are actually doing in this lecture. On the other hand, if you talk about the lower motor neurons, the lower motor neurons, they begin where your upper motor neurons are like ending. So they begin in the CNS, but they are beginning from the anterior horn of the spinal cord, or they can also begin from the brainstem and of the cranial from the cranial nerve nuclei. And they finally go to the peripheral nervous system, and they form the cranial or the spinal nerves. So there is a difference between the upper motor and lower motor neuron. Is basically आपके level पर आपको ये पता होना चाहिए कि it's the difference between the CNS fibers and the fibers which are originating from the CNS, but they're going into the peripheral nervous system. So that's the most important thing. Now, when we classify the descending tracks, we classify them according to there are a few tracks that they become part of the pyramid. Which pyramid I'm talking about? I'm talking about the swelling on each side of the anterior median fissure at the middle of longata. ये आप पढ़ चुके हैं ऑलरेडी ब्रेन स्टेम में. तो अगर कुछ ट्रैक है जो पिरामिड का हिस्सा बन जाते हैं उसको लोग पिरामिडल ट्रैक बोलते हैं, पिरामिडल सिस्टम का पार्ट बन जाते हैं. और जो पिरामिड का हिस्सा नहीं बन पाते तो उनको हम लोग एक्स्ट्रा पिरामिडल सिस्टम बोलते हैं. जो पिरामिडल सिस्टम है वो बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट है. उसमें दो किस्म के ट्रैक्स होंगे, कॉर्टिको स्पाइनल ट्रैक, कॉर्टिको बल्बर ट्रैक. This track is coming from the cortex of this brain and finally entering into the spinal cord. So that's why we call it as corticospinal. Corticobulbar जो होते हैं वो basically brain stem तक रुक जाते हैं, spinal cord तक नहीं जाते, इसलिए हम यहाँ पर spinal word use नहीं करते. So let's just first talk about the pyramidal system. So if I'm talking about the corticospinal tract, so there are two tracks that you can see in this cut section. Now this is the lateral spinothalamic tract, lateral corticospinal tract, and this is basically your anterior or ventral corticospinal tract. So these are the two tracks which are running in the spinal cord, and they're coming from the cortical areas of the brain. The corticospinal tracts, they are basically majorly concerned about the voluntary discrete skill movements. ठीक है, तो आप जितनी भी movement करें, they are done majorly by the corticospinal tract, along with the help of the other tracks जो कि extrapyramidal भी हो सकते हैं, corticobulbar भी हो सकते हैं. And they're formed of one neuron usually, and they usually originate from the large bed cells which are present in the cerebral cortex, which is usually primary motor cortex, जो कि आप लोग functional localization of brain में पढ़ चुके होंगे already. So this is the comparison between the corticospinal and corticobulbar tract. So the blue line that you can follow here, right here, this is coming from the cerebral cortex, going all the way down at the level of medulla oblongata. This is here they decussate. That's called the motor decussation. Some of them decussate, some of them don't decussate. They finally enter the pyramid. They go down till the spinal cord. Okay, the corticospinal tract. But if you follow the green line, that's corticobulbar tract. It originates from the cortex of the brain, definitely going down, 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 and finally they either decussate, don't decussate, but they don't come at the level of spinal cord. यहाँ पे देखिए green line आपको नहीं नजर आ रही. They enter into the middle oblongata and they can synapse with any cranial nerve nuclei. ठीक है जी. So that's the difference between corticospinal and corticobulbar in the pyramidal system. So corticospinal tract is further divided again. जैसे मैंने आपको बताया था, lateral corticospinal tract होता है, एक anterior corticospinal tract होता है. So lateral corticospinal tract, they're made up of the fibers that cross in medulla oblongata, and they supply all the levels of the spinal cord, while the anterior corticospinal tract is something जहाँ पर जो fibers हैं, they do not cross at all. ठीक है, and they cross the fiber cross near the level of the synapse of the lower motor. तो ये बिल्कुल spinal cord के level पे cross कर रहे हो, तो ये ऊपर कहीं cross नहीं करते. ठीक है, they supply the neck and the upper limbs usually. So this is this pretty much summary of it, of both the tracks जो भी अभी आपको बताएं. तो फंक्शनैलिटी में अगर बात करें तो फंक्शन वाइज दे एड स्पीड एंड एजिलिटी टू द कॉन्शियस मूवमेंट, स्पेशली द मूवमेंट्स ऑफ द हैंड, and they provide a high degree of the motor control, which is moving the individual fingers. This is something. Now we talk about the corticobulbar tract. Now corticobulbar tract is, it innervates the head, usually because obviously spinal cord में आनी थी तो उनका ट्रंक रंग से ताल्लुक नहीं होता, तो ये हेड और नेक के लेवल पर ही रहते हैं. And they usually terminate in the reticular formation near the cranial nerve nuclei, and they have their association neurons. For example, they leave the reticular formation and synapse with the cranial nerve nuclei, or they can also go to the lower motor neurons and finally enter into the peripheral nervous system. Now we talk about the extrapyramidal system. The extrapyramidal system में majorly बहुत सारे ट्रैक होते हैं, बट मेजरली ये तीन बड़े इंपॉर्टेंट होते हैं. मैं आपको और भी दिखा देता हूँ. इनके बारे में आपको सिर्फ ये पता होना चाहिए कि ये now these are the tracks which are there to support the corticospinal tract or the pyramidal tract, क्योंकि मेजर काम जो करना है ना वो pyramidal tract ने करना है. ठीक है, जो कि आपकी मूवमेंट करा रहे हैं. एक्स्ट्रा पिरामिडल सिस्टम जो होता है ना, वो आपकी मूवमेंट को बेहतर बनाने के लिए बाकी चीज़ों को हैंडल कर होता है. फॉर एग्जांपल आपका पोस्चर मेंटेन कर रहा होता है. अगर आप फ्लेक्शन करना चाह रहे हैं तो एक्सटेंसर्स मसल को रिलैक्स करेगा. अगर आप एक्सटेंशन करना चाह रहे हैं तो एक ट्रैक होगा जो फ्लेक्सर्स को रिलैक्स करेगा. ठीक है, तो ये वाला सीन है. तो इनके बारे में आपको सिर्फ इनकी फंक्शनैलिटी पता होनी चाहिए और नाम से आपको पता चलेगा कहाँ से आ रहे हैं, कहाँ जा रहे हैं. So let's just talk about them. There is the first tract that's called reticulospinal. The reticular formation से आएगा obviously and spinal cord तक जाएगा. तो this is responsible to inhibit or facilitate the voluntary movement जो कि आपका pyramidal tract करा रहा है. Hypothalamus controls the sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow. तो इनका ताल्लुक होता है इनको further inhibit, facilitate या coordinate कराने के लिए कितनी ज़्यादा intention से ये movement होगी ताकि injuries ना हो. Second tract is basically the tectospinal tract, which is again coming from the tectum and going to the spinal cord. Superior colliculus से आ रहा होता है. ठीक है, और it goes to the uh, alpha and gamma motor neurons in the spinal cord. It is responsible for the reflex postural movement concerning sight. तो जहाँ जहाँ आपका विजन होता है उस हिसाब से आपके जो रिफ्लेक्सेस होते हैं उनको ये कंट्रोल कर रहा होता है टेक्टोस्पाइनल ट्रैक. Then we have rubrospinal tract. Rubro word यूज करते हैं for the red color, and red से हमें याद आता है red nucleus. So rubrospinal tract है, it basically facilitates the activity of the flexors and inhibits the extensors muscle, जो भी मैंने आपको बात करी. तो अगर आपने flexion करनी है तो आपका ट्रूब्रोस्पाइनल ट्रैक इसको फैसिलिटेट कर रहा होगा ताकि एक्सटेंसर्स को रिलैक्स कर सके। इसी का उल्टा काम जो है ना वेस्टिबुलोस्पाइनल ट्रैक कर रहा होता है, जो वेस्टिबुलर न्यूक्लियस से आ रहा होता है, ठीक है, एंड goes through the spinal cord, but it facilitates the extensors and they inhibit the flexor, तो इसका उल्टा काम होता है। ओलिवोस्पाइनल ट्रैक एक और ट्रैक होता है, इसका फंक्शन अभी तक डिस्कवर नहीं हुआ है फिलहाल, तो that's exactly what you need to know about the descending tracks as well as far as your exams are concerned. So this was all about the ascending and the descending tracks of the spinal cord. Inshallah, the next class we'll go further ahead and बाकी चीजें cover करेंगे. If you have any question, do let me know, please. Thank you.